region. I have with me here three remarkable speakers, and I will start right away to introduce them to you. And then we will go into our discussion. We will have around 45 minutes. Then you will have the opportunity to send us your questions, and the speakers will be very happy to answer to them. Our aim is to introduce the monitoring report towards de facto annexation on current events in so-called DNR and LNR in 2020 and 21. And to have an expanded discussion around the report and about the issues that are connected with this report. So how I promised, I will shortly introduce the speakers. There is the author of the report, Nikolaus von Twickel. He's a journalist and expert on Eastern Europe. He has been a correspondent to Moscow and at the Moscow Times and at DPA. He was media liaison officer for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission based 2015-2016 in Donetsk. He reports already since 2016 on events that are happening on the territory of the self-declared People's Republics. Nikolaus, it's great to have you here. He's the author of the report we plan to present and introduce. Very great, Nikolaus, that you are here with us. We have Oleksiy Matsuka with us. He's a renowned journalist in Ukraine. He has been reporting on regional politics in Donetsk until 2014, was then forced to move to Kyiv, and continued to report events happening in the eastern part of the country. He established the Novosti Donbassa platform as a unique information platform for unbiased information on events in the eastern part of Ukraine. He is now editor-in-chief of the TV station Dom TV. That's a broadcasting station opened last year with the aim of providing news to audiences in the eastern part of Ukraine. Oleksiy, it's very great to have you here and to have your insights. I think there are very few people who have such a deep overview on what is happening in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in all the gray areas in between the territories that are currently not controlled by the Kyiv government and that are under control. Oleksiy, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So the next speaker is Monika Lenhard. She is a diplomat at the German Foreign Federal Office. The deputy head of the Ukraine Task Force, that is a unit created after 2014 to unite resources within the German Foreign Ministry. And this task force kind of reflects as well that bilateral relations between Germany and Ukraine are on a more intense and higher level developed, not comparably high intense level developed than it was before 2014. Monika Lenhard is an expert as well on Eastern Europe, Russia, and if I understand right, she was based in Moscow before and in the Eastern neighborhood region as well. So we are very glad that you are joining our discussion. My name is Tim Bose. I work at DIA in projects related to Eastern Ukraine. DIA is an NGO based in Berlin. We cooperate with independent civil society organizations and initiatives in Eastern Europe. We have been working with partners from Eastern Ukraine since 2014 in projects focusing on human rights monitoring, on support for civil society activists on the government-controlled territories. And a lot of our efforts are focusing on this aim to attract more attention on this crucial conflict that is happening in Donbass already for 7 years. So I'm really glad to have this great group of people here for this discussion. And we have an interesting reason to start this discussion. This is Nikolaus' report on Eastern Ukraine. We will send the link in the chat. This report is really interesting. It is not long, so I really recommend it to read. It's entertaining and interesting in a way. So please read the report. And right now I would ask Nikolaus to introduce the main ideas and the report and to give the audience a picture of how these so-called republics are ruled, how the relations with Moscow are, and how the internal and external rules of these structures have changed since 2020.
Thank you, Tim. I'm glad to have this time and to speak to you about this, as I think, highly interesting topic. Is the audio okay? Can everybody hear me? Yes? Good. So I hold the report in my hands and I want to make it really as short as possible. I just want to go through the main points. And I would like to start with the headline towards de facto annexation. This is the first time we actually decided to put a thematic headline on our annual report, since that has been coming out every year since 2016. I would say that de facto annexation is actually nothing brand new. This tendency or this development has been ongoing for the last 3 or 4 years, especially since 2017, since we have been seeing more and more a turn towards Russia in all aspects of life in the so-called People's Republics. And I think the report will try and give a few hints on how this is happening and why this is happening. Last year was a very peculiar year, of course, because of the pandemic, because of coronavirus, because of COVID, affecting all aspects of life, not just in Donetsk and Luhansk, but also, of course, in Russia, Ukraine, and everywhere else in the world. My prediction at the beginning was actually very serious because I still believe that these areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, non-government controlled, they are unique globally because they have the most aged population of any area in the world. I think nowhere in the world you have a higher concentration of old aged people, of pensioners in a small area than here. And this is, of course, a direct consequence of the conflict and the ensuing exodus of a lot of younger and people of working age. The other big thing that happened last year was the change of guard in the Kremlin. That is Mr. Surkov, probably the most interesting and controversial figure in Putin's Kremlin, was forced out of his job and of the Kremlin in January of 2020. And he was replaced by Mr. Kozak. This, of course, was not just a simple replacement, not just a bureaucratic process, but something highly political. And as it's usual in Russian politics also, it came in line together with talk about rivalry and conflict. and that Kozak and Surkov were directly opposed to each other. And there were such reports already ongoing for months. And this seemed to be the climax of this conflict. In short, the replacement of Mr. Surkov with Mr. Kozak, in my eyes, did not result in any significant change of policy or politics, certainly regarding Donetsk and Luhansk. Now you may argue that this was maybe because the pandemic set in only 1 or 2 months later, and the pandemic then made it very hard to conduct any systemic changes. This may be the case, and maybe we will be seeing some more changes right now this year. As we speak this week, we just had a very interesting interview that was published yesterday or the day before yesterday with Mr. Pushilin, the so-called, or the leader of the separatists in Donetsk, who announced that finally the secretive and mysterious company called Vnestok Service will cease to exist and will be replaced by something else. This is, of course, momentous. If I can say anything about the political part of the report, then the main drive last year was, like in the years before, the so-called integration with Russia, i.e. The separatist leaders, they do not talk about anything regarding integration with Ukraine. That is absolutely not on their agenda, even though that is the aim of the Minsk agreement. They talk about integration with Russia. And what I think is important to mention in this context is that integration with Russia, or effectively, I mean, their professed goal is, of course, unification with Russia, political unification. And they are making it clear that this is not a second option or something that they are forced to do because of politics, because of what Ukraine is doing or the West is doing, but rather this is really their professed first goal. And I think it is fair to say that the foundation of the People's Republics was not a goal in itself. It was only seen as a necessary evil on the way towards unification with Russia. So I think it is very important always to bear this in mind, that these people are not interested in maintaining any sort of independence People's Republics, but their end is professed and officially, they repeat it as much as they can, is to achieve unification with Russia. So this, I think, is a very important aspect. One other aspect of internal politics in the Donetsk and Luhansk so-called People's Republics is, of course, the absolute absence of any meaningful opposition, not just of anybody who is pro-Ukrainian. That is, of course, an option that is absolutely not possible. You can't be pro-Ukrainian openly in any way. In Donetsk and Luhansk, but also the so-called internal opposition, the more radical so-called separatists, those who were effectively leading the protests against Kyiv in 2014, basically Russian nationalists who were either from Russia or from Donetsk or Luhansk, but were active in this movement in the beginning. They have largely been silenced, and it has been pretty clear for the last 2 or 3 years that they have absolutely zero chances of getting heard, of making themselves in any meaningful way, of partaking in politics in any meaningful way. And the last year has shown that people like, for instance, Pavel Gubarev in Donetsk, he's just not been heard of for a long time. There is Mr. Purgin, who is active on Kontakte and posts critical commentaries. And there has been Mr. Manikin, who's also a well-known Donetsk blogger. But he, for instance, as we just learned this week, or were reminded this week, has been in prison since December. And a few days ago, he was apparently sentenced to 2.5 years of labor colony because of apparently supporting terrorist activities. So we've seen that the way politics are working here is pretty much totalitarian, and there is no seeming way for critics or opponents to gain any political foothold. The pandemic, of course, that was a big topic last year. Basically, it didn't hit as catastrophic as I first thought it would have in the beginning, when I was talking about the large share of old age population. But the overall effects can well be quite. It's pretty clear that the death toll has been very high, and that the level of infections has also been very high. We don't have any proof of any numbers being right, but we do have some, I think, very interesting. We can make a very interesting observation, and that is that the pandemic has shown that the differences between Donetsk and Luhansk are still substantial, and that they're actually pretty huge if you look at it carefully. What I'm saying is that we can now firmly conclude that the figures that were released by Donetsk are quite truthful, which is if you follow if you read the reports of the last years, you will find that much has been hard to prove, and a lot of information was missing, and there's always the feeling that everything that is being publicly said is not really truth. But in terms of infections and death toll, the reporting from the Donetsk so-called health ministry, I think we can safely conclude is quite close to the truth. I'm not saying that the infection levels are as high as, or the official infection levels are as high as in real life, but that is of course not because they're lying, but just because they don't have enough tests. If they had enough tests, they would. They have said, because they actually released the positive rate, so they are saying, look, we have I don't know 150 positive tests yesterday, but that was 30 or 40% of all the tests that we did, and that is of course far too high, and everybody knows that. And what I'm saying in the report is that the death level, the death toll relative to the population, can now safely established is about as high as in the Czech Republic, if you talk about the Donetsk People's Republic as one entity, and that is I think pretty telling about how the pandemic has affected the local health. At the same time, the numbers, the figures that we have from Luhansk, they are safe to say they were not thought up in by any health workers or health officials. They seem to be 100% political, and they are only a fraction of the whole numbers, both infections and the death numbers. So the Luhansk People's Republic is publishing basically false information about its death levels and infection levels, whereas the Donetsk People's Republic is publishing pretty much what is actually going on. So that has been one, I think, very interesting effect. The other thing is that we have seen the closure of the so-called border between the both People's Republics. And this again, that this was initiated by the Donetsk separatists. And the explanation that Mr. Pushilin has actually given just this week again was that he was afraid that infection levels would increase because of the lax policy in Luhansk versus government-controlled Ukraine, i.e. he was talking about the opening or the non-closure of the pedestrian crossing in Stanica Luhanska and the fear of coronavirus infections being imported from Ukraine, which is of course a complete bullshit. I think everybody who's been looking at at what is going on there can understand. Because all the waves that we have seen of COVID in both Luhansk and Donetsk, they tell us directly that the pandemic has been bad in both areas. And Mr. Pushilin is clearly saying that he knows that the official data that is released by the Luhansk separatists are wrong, cannot be believed. Infections are just as high as in Donetsk probably, but still he wants the border to be closed as of not importing even more coronavirus cases. So that was another interesting aspect of last year's happenings. Apart from that, I think much of what has been ongoing last year has been the continuation of the policies that we have been seeing over the past 3 or 4 years, especially with the economic slump and the ensuing effect on the coal and steel industry. We've also seen increased levels of secrecy on the sides of the separatists that make it very, very hard for us to talk seriously about numbers and about developments in the economy. But we have seen that I think what we can safely say is that the pandemic has caused another serious slump in the economy and forced Russia / the separatist leaders to react again and to try and achieve more restructurization and more closure of unprofitable industry than before. Whenever this happens in economic crisis, of course, a possible outcome is that industry that is no longer viable is being forced to close, and which gives an opportunity to restart the economy in some other sectors where there is more hope for the future. But looking at the rhetoric from people like Mr. Pushilin, I don't see that the people who are in charge are really seeing that maybe the future of the local economy is beyond coal and steel. Because whenever he talks about the massive potential of Donetsk and Luhansk, I think it's quite clear that he's still speaking about coal and steel and not of anything, any modern types of economic activities. But in this respect, I just have to mention as well the interview that Mr. Pushilin gave this week, where he announced the final end of the secretive holding company Vnestorg service. That is, of course, a very interesting development, and I think it speaks of itself that here we basically have a public, the first time that separatist leaders in public admit that the economic policies that were conducted previously have failed. And of course, it will be very interesting to see how these failures will be addressed and what will happen in the future. Finally, the last chapter, human rights and society. Again, a very sad prolongation of tendencies that we've been seeing over the last years. Basically, there are no human rights. There is no civil society. And whatever is said by Russians or by Russian government officials or local separatist officials cannot be taken as face value. The only serious force that is the security services in both People's Republics seem to have more or less absolute power, They like to arrest people whenever they believe it is the right time. It's one thing that we may have seen that there were less arrests of spies like in the years before, maybe because there was less movement across the contact line over the year because of the closures connected to COVID. And so we've seen some high-profile arrests late last year, i.e. in December, and the most prominent of them was Mr. Manikin, who I already mentioned before, who has today been sentenced. So this story, unfortunately, is ongoing, and I'm sure that we will see some interesting more stories like this coming up when both sides maybe agree on another prisoner exchange, maybe later this year. Anything I can say about security, I think I'm also, these reports are becoming quite repetitive, but we did see last year, of course, the highly unusual success of a renewed ceasefire, which has been ongoing or has been holding much better than recent ceasefire initiatives. I would not like to speculate about the reasons, but given that this is the first pandemic that appeared, it could well be that it's also related to the fears that the pandemic can have quite serious consequences among the militaries on both sides, even though now we have seen vaccination levels increasing, of course, on both sides. And we also see a breakdown of the ceasefire, but it's not clear to me whether there is any causation in this. And still, I would like to emphasize that if you look at the numbers that are released by the OSCE mission, the OSCE SMM, you will see that the ceasefire, the level of ceasefire violations, even as we speak today, are still much lower than they were before the renewed ceasefire took place last summer. So my conclusion to this last year and my conclusion from this report is that we haven't seen a single sign of the major political settings in both Luhansk or Donetsk changing. What we have been seeing is some very, very interesting insights into the internal rivalries and the internal struggles between both Donetsk and Luhansk. And of course, this tells us a lot about the lack of control or the disorganized and often dysfunctional political control that comes from Moscow, that is exerted from Moscow over both Luhansk and Donetsk. And I think from here we have a lot to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolaus. I would like to ask a lot of questions, but I think it's better to pass on to Oleksiy. You report intensively. You know the region excellently. It would be a pleasure to hear your impressions of the presentation from Nikolaus. And how do you see this, and what do you think are, from your point of view, significant developments on these territories over the last year?
Yes, thank you, Tim. Good evening, colleagues, and thank you, Nikolaus, for the presentation. Really, you presented the main milestones. But I would like to start to repeat a good phrase from the description for this event. For the international community, the People's Republic, so-called, remain to the large extent a black box. And this report from Nikolaus carefully shows it. I absolutely agree with the conclusions and the fact information that you presented here, but also I want to I also gathered some information to full your report and to show what happened from inside, because we cover the situation in Donbass, in Crimea, in Donbass since 2014, when Russia, so-called Russia Spring started, and I see how the situation changed during all these years and how attitudes of locals change also for the situation. And on the first place, during 2 years that Nikolaus report cover, on the first place, this is of course coronavirus and the reaction of Russia Federation for the coronavirus crisis in Donbass. You know, Russia sends Sputnik 5 and to uncontrolled territory, and there is little information on infection cases. We have people don't trust vaccines. They are not particularly ready to get vaccinated. But we reported some cases when people forced to do this on their companies or schools or universities and other centers. And absolutely same situation with the passportization and Russia, how people get Russia passports. Sometimes some groups, of course, want to get this document, but another people who continue their life in occupied territory or NGCA, for them it's necessary campaign and necessary steps. And according to Russia officials data, we have this data, almost 530,000 Ukrainian citizens have already received Russian passports in the occupied territories in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And according to statements by the Russian side, about 1 million illegal Russian passports may have been issued to Russia residents by the end of 2021. At the same time, representatives of the Russian government and parliament have repeatedly stated that now Russia must protect, including by armed means, people in eastern Ukraine who illegally obtained Russian passports. Of course, all these tracks contrary to Minsk agreement, and it's absolutely clear here in Kyiv how this violation looks like against Ukraine's sovereignty and against human rights people who live in GCA. But another situation, how I see this, how I look on that, it's not very fast pace how people get passports from Russia or so-called passports from self-proclaimed authorities. As I mentioned, some of them, of course, want to do this, but most of them get a passport by necessity. And what else? What next point from my view? This is new class of oligarchs. Their names Igor Andreev and Dmitry Yegornov. This is a new class of oligarchs who work now in uncontrolled territory and who confident of the leader of self-proclaimed authorities, Denis Pushilin. They have very close links, and especially these links build on the economic models. And Nikolaus mentioned Sergei Kurchenko, who controlled Внешторг service, and now this company has really problems with the salaries for locals who demand their salaries from this organization, and we fix every month during last year economic decline on that territory. And average people, they blame Внешторг service for the situation, and they steal plans which since 2017 has controlled over a number of industrial enterprises in NGCA from Внешторг service. This company registered in South Ossetia, and as I mentioned, under control Sergei Kurchenko, who fled to Moscow 2014. And now many enterprises from the structure of Nestor service are stopping in the uncontrolled territory their activities, and employees demand their month and salaries. And this is the reason for strikes and meetings on the street. And we fix a lot of activities near the factories. For example, Alchevsk plant, we filming the strike against the management and these people demanded their salaries. Also, what I want to say about the main situation in NGCA, I think that we should to prepare for next meetings and strikes, because, as I said, the economic situation declined and people feel they like lost, and Russian government and Ukrainian government, they lost this connection with Kyiv, because you know, self-proclaimed authorities create all things to finish this communication and connection. So this is short and brief information from me.
I would like two questions, Oleksiy. Does it make sense to view these so-called people's republics as like totalitarian structures, or do like people like teachers, employees of local government institutions, small business have like a certain sphere where they can act independently, or where they can have like their usual life that is not being influenced by the political structure? That would be the first question. The next question would be on how strong is the influence from Moscow inserted on this region, and how are practical mechanisms of influence?
You know, I see that the average people, they try to separate two different tracks. It is average life, and another, this is the political life. And of course, the main feeling of the majority who live in occupied territory, they try to survive during this period. They try to find more sources to survive. And of course, they see their collaboration with self-proclaimed authorities. I mean, collaboration as, for example, when they get IDs, or when they get some papers or another documents, they see this as like a way for surviving and their life. Of course, when you faced with the security service, so-called security service, who controlled Russians and Pushilin, of course you feel fear, and you feel that you are not protected from their activities. So this is the reason why people choose this is life without any political things, and a lot of people who try to protect themselves and save their families and lives without political influence. I mean political from the self-proclaimed authorities, and also from from the self-proclaimed authorities. But on another hand, if we say about Russia Federation, this center looks like more formal, like a recognized country, like something who can protect them and who give them some papers, documents recognized all around the world. So if you compare these two different centers, self-proclaimed authorities and Russia Federation, of course, people faster choose Russia Federation than self-proclaimed authorities or Republican centers. And this is the reason also I absolutely agree with Nikolaus about reintegration process to Russia Federation faster than they create own independent services, Republican services for the locals, because they, in reality, Pushilin and his friends and his proxies, they want to be a part of Russia Federation because this is for them feeling that they are part of one big country and absolutely another possibilities. They want to be as a Crimea proxies and feel this. Tim?
Thanks a lot, Oleksiy, for presenting your view on the situation. I would like to ask more questions, but I at this moment would pass on to Monika Lenhard. There are informations related to the content of the report that have a political influence. It is showing the difficult realities of the negotiation process with the aim of finding a political solution. And in this context, it would be very interesting to hear how a German diplomat looks at the report in general, what you see in this information that it contains. And of course, for the viewers, it would be very interesting to hear how the German government at the moment looks at the state of the conflict and what is the hope or the perspectives the German government has in regard to finding a solution or to improve to make the ceasefire more sustainable, etc. So all these kind of informations would be very interesting to hear for our audience.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks also for this presentation. I must say that I've been working on the Ukraine task force since last December. I was on the South Caucasus desk before, mainly working on Georgia. So for me personally, this is very, very relevant and very interesting because as you already alluded to, we as diplomats, we're looking sometimes more from a bird's eye perspective. And of course, during these last months, we've been very engaged by this escalating threats or the threatening scenarios of those increased Russian troop movements, on which I maybe can say something a bit later if you like. But for me, it's very, very useful to get the view from the ground, because of course we see news reports, we see reports from our embassy, but it is always different to really hear from the perspective how people perceive their lives. And I think I would just like to touch on some of the issues that you raised, and then maybe try and put them in a bit more of a political context on how we see them. I think the COVID pandemic and what you both said about how it affected those the non-government controlled areas really has been detrimental, probably. And I'd like to then also ask you if that is a correct perception. Has been detrimental to any attempts of crossing the divide between the local populations, just by the pure fact that crossing points were closed off. That people could not easily travel, that they did travel in the other direction, crossing the border to Russia in hundreds every day, but that this probably also contributed to a widening divide that you've also mentioned in the report, the survey, and you've described quite a bleak picture, I must say, when it comes to attempts of bringing populations closer together, of working towards an approximation of the non-government controlled territories to Ukraine, which, as also has been mentioned, of course, is the aim of the Minsk agreements, which we very much, of course, adhere to, and call all the sides also to adhere to and fulfill. So this is what we're working towards, but I will maybe come back to that a little bit later. I also wanted to pick up on the passportization. This is also something that we're watching with great concern. We've been calling it out as not being in line with the spirit and the wording of the Minsk agreements, of course, in many statements, but you know how far statements go sometimes. But it is certainly something that we're also seeing as a potentially very problematic issue. And we've seen this, and that's bringing me back to the Russian troop movements. We've seen some rhetoric also about a possible need to go in and protect the Russian language speakers or Russian nationals or citizens, which then, of course, brings back memories and creates a picture that is not something that we would wish to see. The security, of course, is one of our main concerns. You already rightly mentioned that the ceasefire is holding, but it is also, I wouldn't say it's eroding, but it is becoming more fragile. We've seen over those last months an increase in violations, an increase in civilian and military deaths. Also, if we compare it to the period of last year, starting from the 22nd of July, when this agreement on the additional measures to stabilize the ceasefire was reached. And we do believe, and this is also something that you probably know is being worked on in the trilateral contact group, we believe that it would certainly be necessary and very helpful to have a reconfirmation of the adherence of all sides to the ceasefire. There is, there has not been an agreement, a compromise found, and this, I think, is something that is one of the problems of the works in the negotiation formats, the TCG and the N4 on the advisors level. I would like to stay with the TCG for a moment. Of course, we do believe that Russia bears quite a big responsibility as a signature of the Minsk agreements and their entirety, and also as a member of the trilateral contact group, to exert their influence on the armed formations and on the representatives of the so-called People's Republics, and also to act constructively within these formats. And it must be said that the blocking or the lack of progress is very often due to a lack of political will on the Russian side to engage. So, for example, we have some other humanitarian security issues that could be tackled that are pretty much, would be ready on a technical level, like demining or the opening of those new crossing points, but which are being blocked by a lack of political will. So this is certainly something that we are striving for. We're trying our utmost within the N2 format, France and Germany, also on the level of the N4 advisors, to really use the momentum that there was, possibly still is, but especially was there after the ceasefire, the added measures were agreed upon, and try and bring those negotiations forward. I'm not going to disclose much from the N4, the Normandy discussions, because we believe that these should be held in confidentiality. This is not shared by all the participants, as we've also seen over the last months. There have been some leaks, but we believe that this is something that really should stay behind closed doors. of course, we're working towards the implementation of the Minsk agreements and the Paris summit conclusions. But what I can say is that it is also a very slow-moving process with not a lot of progress recently, which is quite deplorable. But you will have seen also probably reports or press statements about a trilateral phone call that happened between our minister and the French foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister yesterday, in which they also discussed the state of play in the negotiations and possibilities of moving forward. So we as the foreign ministry are also trying to flank a role for the foreign ministers is foreseen. And then, yeah, maybe I will leave it at this, and we go into a round of questions, or you can reiterate your questions.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of questions. The point is, we have about 10 minutes left in our short talk, and I would propose to really to focus on the language on the questions we got from the audience. So I would read some of the questions and would ask just you to comment on them. So one question is directly to Nikolaus, but maybe Oleksiy could answer as well. What kind of media or what kind of sources do you check? Kontakte, Telegram channels. What kind of sources do you have under circumstances where you have no access, where you're not allowed to enter these territories, and if you want to report? So that's the first question. And maybe a second question that was asked in relation to human rights as well. Can you expand on human rights a little bit more and focus on the question of freedom of belief, or the situation of believers in the region? And can I ask you to give short answers, because there are some more questions? It would be great to answer most of them, maybe.
I want to give answer about the sources. Okay, Tim?
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, it's impossible to work in GCA, but we found different sources and resources. And civic journalism is actively developing now. TikTok, this is the main source where today Ukrainian journalists, from where we can get information. And also, when critical events occur, people don't hesitate to post videos of strikes or meetings. And now, for example, as I mentioned, a difficult situation in Alchevsk, Luhansk. There are people protesting there, and we are collecting information from Kontakte, Odnoklassniki, and TikTok. So the social networks, this is the main sources for video pictures, for pictures. But if we talk about the information sources, of course, these absolutely different sources, and the same sources what we use during average life, not only from occupied territory. But TikTok now is the most developed network.
Nikolaus, would you like to add?
Yeah. I would just say that the internet is an amazing resource, especially as we learned this in this conflict. And in fact, I mean, the level of freedom of speech in the so-called People's Republics is, of course, detrimental. And it's much, much worse than in Russia, where it's already bad and getting worse. But still, as Oleksiy pointed out, and as you can read in my report, there are still lots of resources which enable people to make their voices heard. the reason why we don't hear a lot about them here in the West or even in Kyiv is sadly that there is no way for journalists either from Ukraine or from the West to enter the People's Republics, the so-called ones. So this is really the major problem that we have. We did have, of course, instances last year where, especially in the Luhansk, so-called Luhansk People's Republic, the internet was banned, or was parts of the internet were blocked because of ongoing strikes, miners' strikes. And that is an option, that is a possibility. It sort of worked at the local level, but I think we have not seen major internet outages or major internet censorship in this way. Although, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Oleksiy, the overall picture is that internet protests do not necessarily lead to widespread protest in both areas. And I think this is mainly because the big potential, those in the population who potentially who would potentially participate in, say, pro-Ukrainian protests have left over the course of the last years. So that's one thing. And also, if you are interested in what sort of media resources I use or you can use, I mean, mainly Russian language, of course, they are in the sources bit of the report. You can look that up. There was one question about faith. I would just briefly give an answer. We did not put that in last year because it was not the biggest topic, but we have put it in previous years. The thing is that, of course, anybody who is not of Orthodox faith and maybe part of the Moscow Patriarchate is potentially subject to persecution in both Donetsk and Luhansk. We have seen this, especially with the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have been persecuted in Russia for many years now, or for a few years, and who have been banned consecutively in Donetsk and Luhansk. Whoever was a member of Protestant non-conformist churches there would also be probably not able to take part in religious life. What we have seen then is that the Roman Catholic community has been allowed to operate on a low but surprisingly free basis over the past years. But I've just seen that now they have trouble bringing back in the only priest in Donetsk. So this is obviously an issue. As I say, religion is not a big issue in this conflict, but yes, there have been serious sanctions being taken by the separatist authorities, by the de facto authorities against certain confessions. That is absolutely a fact.
There's one more question relating to the entry-exit points, checking points at the so-called contact line, and how open are they at the moment, and who is they have been closed, and they have been closed to a large degree in 2020. Who was responsible for closing these checkpoints, and what kind of effects did they have? And there was another question related to the security services, who seems to play a crucial role. There was this question: are they controlled by the local de facto authorities, or are they rather controlled from Moscow?
Oleksiy?
Yes, okay. Of course, we understand that checkpoints blocked during 1 year from the self-proclaimed authorities, and Pushilin and Pasechnik, they used this situation to control traffic, people traffic, to control territory. And for example, now when a campaign for students start in Kyiv, and Kyiv very openly for young people from occupied territory. Now we have a very flexible conditions for them to study in. And of course, this is the reason why Pushkin and Pasechnik tried to block all connections. And of course, in Kyiv, we have a lobby organizations, NGOs, activists, journalists who promote ideas about free connections and flexible conditions for those people who travel through Russia, from NGCA through Russia to Ukraine, in Kharkivska Oblast or another points, without any fees, because now it's illegal when you travel from NGCA to Russia and from Russia to Ukraine. So this is from the border control, looks like something wrong what you did, and you should to pay fee for that. And NGOs and activists in Kyiv try to change this and work in parliament with the deputies about on this track. So from Ukrainian side, Ukraine keeps open all checkpoints during 10 hours per day, I think, when working hours, and everyone from occupied territory can visit Ukraine, part of Donbass, without any restrictions. But the main problem from that side, who, as I said before, closed their checkpoints.
Shall I add something?
It would be great to add, and there was the second question as well.
Which one?
The one relating to the security services.
Oh yes. So the checkpoint thing, as Oleksiy explained, there's one more issue to it, and that is the differences between Donetsk and Luhansk. In Luhansk, you only have the pedestrian crossing in Stanica Luhanska, which thankfully was repaired last year, 2 years ago. But the situation is that the Luhansk People's Republic kept this one checkpoint open, at least since last autumn. Whereas in Donetsk, all the checkpoints were closed, and only the one in Olenivka is operating right now, but on a very, very, very restricted basis, because the Donetsk separatists allow in only a very, very few, only people who have been previously approved on a list. And this is basically extremely restrictive. And this leads to the latest figures from the UN I saw was that we still have 95% less traffic across the contact line since 2019. So extremely little. And then we have the issue of the two new checkpoints that were supposedly to open last year in the Luhansk Oblast. This is Zolote and Shastya, gold and success. Or luck, and we see no gold and no success again, because even though both sides agreed of implementing the infrastructure and everything is ready, could be worked, but the checkpoints were not opened last year amid another typical both each side blaming the other side. But it's quite clear, I think, that the people in Luhansk didn't want them to open again. So there is a big issue here, and this has to be solved in the framework of the Trilateral Contact Group. So regarding the security services, the MGB, this is a big topic for us who watch this space, who watch this black box. And there are some competing theories, but I think everybody agrees that the MGBs are the ones who have most influence in the local security situation, and that they are directly controlled from Moscow. There is always the issue of whether the MGB, the line of control between Moscow and the MGB is the same line of control as from Moscow to the heads of the People's Republics. In Luhansk, you have a former MGB guy who is actually the head of the People's Republic, whereas in Donetsk, you have somebody from outside. So this always gives room for speculation. But overall, we can just assume that the MGBs are being given free range. They can act arbitrarily as they would like to. And if there is any conflict between them and other separatists or between them and Moscow, then we are the last to know, because this is not going to be made public unless there is some accident that will happen.
Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we are already getting to the end of this interesting discussion. I would like to give you like a short moment for a closing statement. So maybe you have some final thoughts that you would like to share with the audience. I would be very glad to hear you with a closing statement.
Oleksiy?
Yes, I want to say thank you for this event, team, because it's really very important to understand what happened in occupied territory, also in Crimea, also not only in Donbass, but Crimea also on that track. And I hope that our introduction and these milestones and report Nikolaus help understand more what happened with the people in during this period, how they survive on these difficult conditions in Donbass and in Donetsk, Luhansk, and what they feeling when they live without recognized authorities, what they should do to survive, how they find the way to continue to save and protect their families, because it's really very important for us, and especially for me, a person from Donbass, from Donetsk originally, and I left that territory 2014 when Russia Spring so-called started, but we continue also our work, and especially informational work for Donbass residents through borders, through threats and other things. And I hope this event and another informational works that Nikolaus did and will do, and new reports help to understand what happened in reality and ground zeros. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleksiy. I don't know, shall I carry on, or should Monika say something before me? No? Okay.
I can go and leave the last word to you, maybe, to round it up. Yeah, I can also just thank you, really thank you, side also for the questions of the German government. I'm not going to go into very much detail. I'm just like to briefly touch upon it and say that I don't really agree that we don't that we don't support Ukraine on this issue. We've been negotiating the Minsk agreements. We very much, as I said, are pushing for to keep the momentum, to bring them forward with very clear policies on the annexation, the illegal annexation of Crimea. We're doing a lot also in terms of trying to stabilize the humanitarian situation, supporting dialogue. And I think, yeah, well, the internet, great resource, as has been mentioned before. So you can also read up office. I just leave it at that here for this. I think you can still hear me. I'm just getting a message that my internet is not stable. I just wanted to also mention one point, as I am the only woman on this panel, may almost have been an all-male panel. In the next report, or maybe also in your final words, maybe you could also touch upon the situation of women in the territories, because we've seen it in many other places that, especially during the COVID pandemic, issues like violence against women, domestic violence have really risen. So this would maybe be something that may be interesting to look into. And also we are currently thinking about finding ways on how to involve women more in the conflict resolution and the peace building process. as this is, of course, it has been, well, almost scientifically proven that women in these processes is very helpful. But this, I think, is something for maybe the next report, our next discussion round. So I will leave it at this.
Thank you. Yes, I will take this up. I would also like to mention Freedom House, which the American organization that publishes reports on freedom in the world, and where there is also a report that has come out this year and last year about Eastern Donbass, as they call it. And this actually does have something about the role about women's issues. And we will have another discussion with Freedom House about this in a couple of weeks. But thank you for the reminder. Yes, I think for me, I would just like to mention one thing, and that is so-called passportization and the so-called and the building up of forces, as Oleksiy mentioned it before. I think it's important to say at the end, well, at this point in the year 2021, that fortunately, the fears that were running very high in Ukraine did not materialize, that Russia would use the passportization, or the fact that it has now illegally citizens in the so-called People's Republics as a pretext to start another military intervention. And I think it is important to point out what is also written in the report's security section, that the basic deterrence that is in place, has been in place since 2015 in the region, continues to hold. And that is, there are certain consequences if Russia decided to launch a military attack. There are also certain consequences if Ukraine would try to retake the territories, the areas that it has no control of right now. And we always have to keep that in our mind when we discuss this ongoing conflict. And it is my deep conviction that we're not talking about a military conflict in the sense that either side will at some point gain the upper hand and retake territories. We are talking about a deeply political conflict where the military dimension that has been building up over the past 6 years is a consequence of, and but is used and is, if you want to say, utilized by both sides politically as a tool to at last influence public opinion. And we, I think, have seen this very clearly in the military buildup that was that happened in Russia this spring. I think it was absolutely no coincidence that this happened after the inauguration of the new administration in the United States of America. We have seen a similar military escalation, even worse in terms of human lives lost after the inauguration of President Trump 4 years ago. And this will be a constant, I think, a thread in this awful conflict, that the military dimension is utilized by the political leaderships to build up public pressure. Thank you.
The audience, thanks that you were interested in this topic and that you took part and were watching our talk. Thanks a lot to the speakers that you found the time to participate in this discussion. It was very impressive to hear your view on the current situation in Eastern Ukraine. We will continue our work. I will be very glad in the future to continue to discuss with you the situation in Eastern Ukraine. Please take a look at the report as well. We will post the link of the report on the Facebook page. If you want to get regular and continuous information, we publish a newsletter. You can subscribe to the newsletter on civicmonitoring.org, and we will keep you informed. Have a nice evening, and Thank you a lot.
Дуже дякую.